Welcome back to the Canadian Politics Update, this time for November 2025. For the most part in November, things were concentrated in two main camps in terms of what this channel is interested in looking at, and that would be the federal budget and all the fallout surrounding the budget, and then the gun confiscation and all the fallout that's surrounding that. Those are the two main stories that are happening this month, so we'll start with the gun stuff and we'll end with the budget. But there is one thing I'll put in the middle about a deal that was struck just today that we need to talk about. So, starting first, let's talk about the gun buyback / confiscation. The pilot program in Nova Scotia captured apparently up to 22 firearms. Now, the actual quote was anywhere between 10 to 22 firearms, which is a little suspicious. And that I wonder if someone said they captured a 1022, which would be really funny considering it's not banned. But I think the reality is they probably captured actually 22 firearms, and those firearms probably came from 1, 2, or 3 people. Very likely came from only a handful of people. And as a reminder, they were expecting to get 200 from this program. Now, the Carney government was looking at analyzing the results of the pilot program, and don't worry, they think it all went great. Quote, by all accounts, technical capabilities have been satisfied and we are looking forward to rolling out the program across Canada over the coming weeks. That is what the public safety minister said, and even Provost, who is now an MP, said the program is going well because one of its first issues was to see if the system worked. They're essentially saying, who cares how many people turned in their guns? The whole system worked. Yay. And what is the system? Well, the system is essentially the collection and the noting down of who turned in what. That's all they're talking about. I don't even think they're talking about destruction, because in this case, I'm pretty sure there was no destruction done to any of these firearms, at least not yet. So we don't even know how the full thing is going to work. And then a few days after that, we got the official confirmation that yes, they are still going to go ahead with the confiscation program. The civilian one, that is. Now, this is not a surprise. How this looks in practice, we still have absolutely no idea. But they're not backing down, and they're not backing down because that's not the point of this whole thing. As I've been saying for about the last year, getting this program done is the goal, not successfully doing the program. The government just wants to say, we offered the program, we executed the program is closed, it's behind us, we don't need to worry about it. They don't care how many criminals they make out of regular people. But now that leads us to the confiscation program with the retailers. As you can see, Ottawa delayed the restart of the confiscation program from retailers. Now, what is going on here? Well, this has everything to do with the CZ Colt Canada scandal of the last month. Of course, they are not going to confirm anything officially, but Ian Runkle, who is part of, well, the lead of this whole thing, said, I heard a rumor that they lost their disposal company, which in this case would have been Colt Canada. So what does this mean? Well, it means less than you might hope it means. This is only on the retailer side of the program, and if you remember, the retailer program has been going on for over a year at this point. Not to mention, it's actually also majority finished. They allocated $30 million to the retail confiscation program in the $750 million that they promised in the last few months, but of that $30 million, $20 million had already been used in the program in the last year and a bit. So monetarily speaking, it was already 66% done. And this very likely has no impact on the civilian side of things, because we still don't know who is doing the civilian side of things. Colt Canada and, well, more specifically, CZ Group was very specific in saying they did not and will not have any effect on the civilian confiscation program. They did not deny being involved in the retailer confiscation program because that is obviously what they were doing. But even when this whole thing was happening, they were very adamant that they had nothing to do with the civilian side. So we don't know who's going to run the civilian storage and destruction of firearms, but I don't think it's going to be as big of a deal as people might think. Now, what does this mean in the long term? Well, there are two possibilities for how this is going to go. Number one is that they just cancel the retail part of the confiscation program and businesses just keep what they have or try and sell them internationally. And number two is that they're going to use the same program that they are for the civilian side for the business side. How that works, we have no idea, but again, those are really the two main options. There is a possibility that they try and find another company that's specific for the retail confiscation, but I have my doubts about that. It's not necessarily too difficult, but it's also a lot of paperwork and a lot of searching, and I don't really think they want to do that. So my bet is that they're probably just going to try and roll this in with the civilian confiscation, which, again, no idea what the hell is going on with that on the logistics side. Now, the Saskatchewan government also introduced some amendments to its Saskatchewan Firearms Act. Now, as I record this, the bill actually passed one of the readings. I don't know if it passed through all of the readings in the Saskatchewan legislature, but I know it passed at least the initial reading with unanimous support. If you're not aware, the Saskatchewan NDP is very pro-gun. They have voted unanimously with the Sask Party to pass the pro-gun legislation in Saskatchewan. So this is not a surprise that this was passing. But we need to talk about what this is, and it is actually very interesting. It says, the legislation proposes that anyone who seizes a firearm under new federal firearm laws must pay the owner fair market value as determined by the Saskatchewan Firearms Commissioner. Firearms will be deemed as seized in Saskatchewan if both the firearm is impacted by federal firearms legislation or bans, and the owner does not receive fair market compensation with 12 months of the federal legislation or ban coming into effect. Now, this is very interesting. Number one, it doesn't say in the last 5 years, so theoretically this could apply to any firearms that are still legally owned that were prohibited in the 2000s, 80s, 90s, whatever. I also wonder if this applies to handguns, specifically handguns that are part of the estate, because while handguns are not federally banned, so I wonder if maybe handguns are included in this. Who knows? But you might be thinking to yourself, wait, Saskatchewan is taking part in the confiscation program? And no, they're not. If you recall, Saskatchewan joined Alberta in setting up the Saskatchewan Firearms Act in the last couple of years, and what that did was essentially limit the federal government's ability to confiscate firearms. Now, how would they do that? Well, firearms and their regulation are part of the criminal code, and that is a federal jurisdiction. However, the use of personal property is provincial jurisdiction, and so Alberta and Saskatchewan are arguing that, yes, the federal government can determine what's legal, but we can determine who can seize private property. So Alberta and Saskatchewan set up their own forces that are allowed to seize firearms, but here's the catch: no one is hired in those firms. So essentially they're just ghost organizations that have no actual manpower to do the job that they're assigned to do, and that's intentional. So no one in Saskatchewan is going to have their firearms seized because of the Saskatchewan Firearms Act that exists. But as they point out in this whole thing, it's for one very specific reason. Saskatchewan firearms owners will then be able to use the appraisals as evidence in court to hold the federal government accountable for providing fair compensation for all those affected by legislation. Now also, one thing above it that I need to mention, they say they're going to launch an online portal soon that will give appraisals for all firearms, ammunition, and accessories impacted by federal legislation. So think things like 50 BMG ammunition, which can no longer legally be shot out of basically anything, as well as upper receivers for guns or barrels or bolts or whatever and all that have been banned. But as the sentence below states, this is mostly a legal tool to help Alberta and Saskatchewan's fight in court against the federal government. Now, whether this takes place in the challenge to the Supreme Court about this topic, or if this takes place in, say, a new challenge that's launched based on fair market value and the federal government paying for things, we'll have to wait and see. But there is room for this to grow over time. Now, finally, there's also 3 other things that this bill does, and one of them is related to the confiscation. They say the amendments will also allow the Saskatchewan Firearms Office to collect and store firearms on behalf of Saskatchewan firearms owners who wish to voluntarily turn in their firearms. This will ensure firearm owners do not face potential criminal charges for possessing prohibited firearms while they pursue compensation from the federal government. Now, to me, this sounds like it is a way to get around the criminality part of it. It very specifically says to collect and store firearms on behalf of Saskatchewan firearms owners. So I wonder if what Saskatchewan is trying to do is trying to say, you can keep your firearms, no one is going to be allowed to confiscate them in the province, but if you're worried about the criminality tied to keeping prohibited firearms, you can, quote, turn them in, and we will store them for you, but not destroy them for you. And then when the laws change, hopefully when they change, you will be able to collect your firearms again from this program. Now, I don't know how popular this is going to be. I don't know how many people are going to do this. I actually think this might be a really good idea for restricted firearms. For example, if you own an AR-15 and you turned in your lower receiver to the Saskatchewan Firearms Office, and you'd actually have to do the upper receiver as well because that was deemed prohibited, but you could strip them both and put them in the Saskatchewan Firearms Office. They could hold them for you, and you would have no criminality attached to you, and when the laws change, you can get them back. The other two things are not related to the confiscation. One is allowing the Chief Firearms Officer to inspect ranges and clubs designated and designate firearm safety instructors in the province. Now, this is a power I thought they already had. Maybe they just hadn't officially claimed it yet, but they were still doing it. This seems like it might just be some paperwork to make sure things are all above board. But then there's this. Enable medical professionals to report patients to the SFO if they have a medical condition that may impact their ability to use or possess firearms safely. And this is a bit worrying because things like this often have unintended consequences, and one of them in this case is very likely going to be that gun owners are not going to pursue medical attention that they desperately need. Whether it's mental or physical health, they might decide, I don't want to lose my guns, so I'm just not going to get medical help when they really need medical help. In an ideal world, this can be mitigated with the SFO having the final say and not the doctors or medical personnel. If that's the case, then they theoretically should be able to get over the anti-gun zealot doctors that exist, because they exist everywhere. Hopefully, this is something that will not have a negative impact, but I am worried about that. And quickly, before we get to the budget topics, this was just announced today, not long ago at all, that there was an agreement between Alberta and the federal government on energy. Now, this is more complicated than it seems on the surface. The very easy things, the things that take effect right away and are very good things, are that there are no oil and gas production caps and no new net zero power regulations. Now, those will take effect easily. The federal government controls those things, so Alberta will be able to continue producing its natural resources in the way that it has over the last few years. So that is at least a good thing for the Canadian economy, the Alberta economy, and all that. But everything underneath it is not straightforward. New 1 million barrel per day pipeline to Asian markets, 400,000 barrel per day TMX expansion, and a deepwater port access for oil tankers. Now, as I would hope you would all know, Alberta has no coastline, which means it has to go through another province or the United States. This is very specifically about a pipeline going through British Columbia as well. And Carney gave the British Columbia government a veto on this whole program. Now, this is a problem because BC, under its current NDP government, is never going to approve of this. Absolutely never. And while they have a minority government, they're propped up by the Greens, who, of course, are never going to vote for this either. So that puts this whole thing in jeopardy. And I'm going to read what Pierre said. He said, "Today's memorandum does not promise a pipeline will be built. It promises that 7 months from now, a pipeline proposal will be referred to a federal office for 2 further years of study." Essentially, this memorandum of understanding that Alberta and the federal government have come to is, we want this to happen, but we know it can't happen until the BC government changes either its mind or itself entirely. Now, the BC politics right now are really, really strange. It was looking like BC would have an election really soon, and they still might. Things are pretty shaky in BC. I don't think they're going to go the distance on this minority government. But the Conservative Party of BC is shambolic. It is the worst-run Conservative Party in all of Canada, and it's not even close. One BC, who has spawned out of the Conservative Party of BC, has taken up a fair amount of their votes. And how many seats this will lead to, who knows, but it does mean vote splitting on the right in BC, which means the Conservative or a Conservative government in British Columbia is unlikely to win at the moment, unless they were to come to an understanding not to run candidates against each other, which is very unlikely. Things are not looking good on the BC side of this whole memorandum of understanding. Granted, it's still good progress, just not the progress we might want to see. And now we can finally talk about the budget. So the budget was proposed, we know it passed, we know there was no election, but let's go over what happened during the budget. Well, CBC has this article, and it's not a terrible article for describing what is going on. The key budget highlights are as such: $141 billion over the next 5 years, but it's offset by $51.2 billion in cuts and savings. There is a note on this, and we will get to that. A $78 billion deficit this fiscal year, which is lower than some economists expected, but it's also not totally accurate. Depending on the definition you used of deficit and what counts as deficit spending, it could be higher. If you're going to use the most lenient definition, you get the government's answer, which is the $78 billion. But if you use the Parliamentary Budget Officer's definition, you get $94 billion deficit. So whatever one you choose, it's between $78 and $94 billion deficit, which is almost double what the deficit was under Freeland when she resigned and it caused Trudeau to step down. So we're still at huge deficits here. But what does it all include? Slashes to bureaucracy by nearly 40,000 jobs through buyouts and attrition. The buyouts and attrition is key because this will happen over the course of the next few years, but this is actually a very good thing. We really needed to cut the bureaucracy in Canada because it was way too bloated, and it's not a good sign for an economy when so much of your workforce is working for the government. You want your workforce to work for the private sector to grow the economy. $51 billion for infrastructure and $81 billion for the Canadian Armed Forces. Now this part is the part that sounds good in theory and is actually good in theory, but I don't think we're actually going to get to this. Now, Matt Gurney put out a good tweet at the time when it happened. He said, "No way military can spend all that money in anything close to its current form. This is going to require massive overhauled procurement and services component and a much larger force. We'll probably try harder for the latter, but if we don't do the former, it won't work." That is the key point. This whole thing relies on, well, both the infrastructure and the military relies on your trust of the Canadian bureaucracy and its ability to effectively spend money. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's going to ultimately end up happening is this money is either going to sit and not be spent, or it's going to be spent extremely inefficiently and we're not going to get good value out of it. Both of those things are bad. There are different kinds of bad, but either way, I don't think we're going to get what Carney is promising here. And to be fair, this is a problem the Conservatives would have as well, because we need major overhaul to the bureaucracy. And no, the 40,000 jobs that are being cut, if they weren't cut, would not improve this. The problem is not the number of employees, the problem is the process the bureaucracy goes through. If you remember, the F-35 had been talked about under Harper, and we're still talking about it. Not to mention the handguns that we had from World War II that only just got replaced in the last 5 years. Canadian bureaucracy moves extremely slowly and inefficiently, and I just don't think this is going to result in what people hope it does. Having said that, the budget did pass 170 to 168, but if you're thinking to yourself, that sounds really close, well, that's because things were not quite as they seem. The Conservatives did not want an election, no matter what they say. Nobody wanted an election right now except maybe the Liberal government. Scheer and Reid were actually waiting outside the House of Commons just in case the NDP did not abstain enough votes for the budget to pass with just Liberal votes. But when the NDP did abstain, they ran back in and voted against the budget. The NDP had 2 people abstain and the rest of their caucus voted against the budget, which is actually significant. To me, it shows that the NDP is actually serious about trying to distance themselves from the Liberals, unlike Singh, but they just were not ready for an election right now because they're still going through a leadership contest. And when they get that leader, I really don't think this parliament is going to last long. I think there is a very high chance we have an election in 2026 because of the unstable nature of this parliament. Now, one Conservative MP also didn't vote, and that's Shannon Stubbs. She had a medical leave that was known well before. Yes, she maybe could have voted by phone, but the Conservatives are already not going to allow an election to happen, so this doesn't really matter. Now we need to talk about Chris d'Entremont. He is an MP from Nova Scotia. He's a former Conservative MP and now Liberal MP. In the last Politics Update, I reported that there were 3 Conservative MPs that were being courted by the Liberals to turn coat, and Chris was one of them. However, Chris did not move from Conservative to Liberal because of any ideology. He moved because his feelings were hurt. In the last Parliament, so the one before the last election, he put his name up for Speaker, and he came close, but he was second place, and his name didn't end up getting put for the speakership role. And this Parliament, when the time came to elect a new Speaker, he thought he should just automatically be given the Conservative nomination and let that be it. But no, there was of course another vote, and he lost the vote again. This really hurt his feelings, and ever since then, he has changed his tune. He was in the parliament speaking about how the Carney government was hurting Nova Scotians in his community. And yet, he turned coat anyway because his feelings were hurt. There is no other way to say this than this is a betrayal. Yes, it's a betrayal to the people that voted for him, but it's a more significant betrayal to the people that paid money for his campaign and the people who volunteered their time and effort to get him elected. This was a very close race, and he completely betrayed everyone. Now, ideally speaking, you're electing a member of parliament, not a party. But we all know that that's just not true. People do not vote for a name unless it is a very special circumstance. They vote for a party. And so in my opinion, no matter where you're floor crossing, whether that's to the Liberals, from the Liberals, to the NDP, from the NDP, whatever, if you decide to change your party, in my opinion, you should force a by-election. You should not be able to do this kind of stuff and not have to face your constituents with what they actually want. Now, there was another one the Liberals were courting, and that is Matt Genereux out of Edmonton, or, well, the outskirts of Edmonton. He was courted by the Liberals, but he ended up just resigning or planning to resign. He's going to resign in the next few months. This is not that surprising because his riding is never going to go Liberal, and he would have been absolutely skewered for going Liberal. This is a riding that is solidly conservative and has been for decades, or at least not the specific riding, but, you know, the people that make up the riding in the region has been conservative for decades. The Liberals got closest in this past election because the NDP died, but it still wasn't enough and it wasn't close. So he decided he'd rather just resign, which, fair enough, this is going to go to the Conservatives anyway in the by-election. No hurt feelings about it. But that does it for this video. A lot of news. I actually had to record this twice because I completely messed up the original recording, which is really annoying, but it's done. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got some more information on what happened in the past month in Canadian politics. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.